When Novak Djokovic speaks, the tennis world listens. The greatest player of all time doesn't hand out compliments casually or waste words on empty flattery. So when he called Alex Eala a superstar during a press conference at the Australian Open, that wasn't just a nice gesture or polite acknowledgement. That was a stamp of approval from the sport's ultimate authority, a public endorsement that could fundamentally change the entire trajectory of a young player's career. This was Djokovic, the man with 24 Grand Slam titles, recognizing something special and putting his legendary reputation behind it. But what exactly did Djokovic say about the Filipino tennis sensation? Why did his words carry so much more weight than the typical praise athletes exchange? And what does this mean for Alex Eala as she navigates the impossible pressure of representing 110 million people while trying to establish herself on the professional tour? The story behind Djokovic's comments reveals something much bigger than just one player's rise. It exposes how tennis is transforming before our eyes, how the sport's infrastructure is struggling to keep up with globalization, and how players from unexpected countries are forcing the establishment to completely rethink everything they thought they knew about building stars and managing crowds. Djokovic was doing a routine press conference at the Australian Open, the kind of mandatory media obligation that comes with being one of the biggest names in tennis. A reporter asked him about the evolution of the tournament over the 20-plus years he's been competing in Melbourne. It was a pretty standard question, the kind that usually generates bland, forgettable responses. They wanted to know his thoughts about the massive crowds that now pack Melbourne Park, the corporate sponsorships plastered everywhere, and the growing complaints from some traditionalists that the event has become too commercial, too crowded, that it's lost something essential in its transformation from scrappy tournament to global mega event. Most players, when asked something like this, would deliver some carefully worded diplomatic answer about how it's wonderful to see tennis growing and attracting new fans, while also respecting the sport's traditions. Safe, boring, forgettable. But Djokovic took the question in a completely different and far more interesting direction, one that revealed both his deep understanding of tennis history and his recognition of where the sport is headed. He said that complaining about overflowing crowds and overwhelming attendance is fundamentally a luxury problem, the kind of issue that every tournament organizer in the world would love to have. He pointed out that selling out tickets and shattering attendance records is exactly what success looks like in professional sports. Then he dropped this line that perfectly captured his perspective. There are far worse nightmares for a tournament to face than having too many passionate fans desperate to watch matches. That's classic Djokovic wisdom, the perspective of someone who has been around long enough to remember when things were very different. The Serbian legend has competed at the Australian Open since the early 2000s, and he's witnessed firsthand the tournament's remarkable transformation. He got specific about the old days, reminiscing about facilities that seem almost unbelievable now. He talked about borrowing gym space from a local Australian football club, just so players had somewhere adequate to warm up and prepare. He mentioned using a facility across the street that belonged to some Aussie rules team, initially saying Essendon before correcting himself to Collingwood, and apologizing to fans because apparently that particular rivalry is extremely serious business in Australian sports culture. The point Djokovic was making with this trip down memory lane is that the Australian Open has undergone a complete transformation from a tournament that was literally scraping by with borrowed facilities and makeshift arrangements to an absolutely massive global sporting event with state-of-the-art indoor arenas, world-class recovery centers, premium restaurants, luxury accommodations, and five-star everything you could possibly imagine. That evolution, in his view, isn't some kind of betrayal of what tennis used to be or a sellout of the sport's pure competitive soul. It's concrete proof that tennis is winning, that the sport is attracting more mainstream attention and passionate interest than ever before in its history. But then Djokovic pivoted to Alex Eala, and this is precisely where things got really interesting and meaningful. He brought up the absolute chaos that happened when her match was scheduled on a tiny outer court at Melbourne Park, and thousands upon thousands of Filipino fans showed up desperately trying to get in to watch their national hero compete. He acknowledged that it had been the talk of the locker room, with players and coaches buzzing about what happened. Security barriers were being pushed to their absolute limits. The crowd management logistics completely collapsed. It was genuine chaos that caught everyone off guard, Now here's the absolutely key part of what Djokovic said, the detail that matters most. He didn't frame this incident as some kind of disaster or embarrassing failure by the tournament organizers who should have known better. Instead, he framed it as powerful evidence of something much bigger happening in tennis right now, a fundamental shift in the sport's global reach and appeal. He readily acknowledged that the Australian Open officials probably should have anticipated the massive response and scheduled Eala on a significantly bigger court with proper capacity. That was a scheduling mistake, certainly. But the real story, the thing that actually matters, is why so many people showed up in the first place with such passionate intensity. Alex Eala represents an entire nation in a way that very few athletes ever do. The Philippines has a population of over 110 million people, and they have never had a tennis player capture serious global attention and achieve significant success on the world stage like this before. Tennis has never been their sport. They've produced world-class boxers. Basketball has massive popularity, but tennis was always something other countries dominated. When Djokovic calls Eala a superstar, that's not some throwaway compliment or polite thing to say about a young up-and-comer. That's the greatest player in tennis history, the man who has achieved everything possible in the sport. Recognizing that Alex Eala has genuinely transcended being just another promising young player with potential. She's become a legitimate cultural phenomenon, someone whose significance extends far beyond ranking points and tournament results. The weight she's carrying on her shoulders isn't just about her individual ranking or her personal results on court. It's about representing an entire country of 110 million people who see her as their ambassador on the world's biggest sporting stages, as proof that Filipinos can compete and win at the absolute highest levels of global competition. That's an entirely different level of pressure and expectation than what most young players experience. This is where some serious sarcasm is warranted because, let's be brutally honest here about what happened. The Australian Open organizers absolutely, completely, embarrassingly dropped the ball on this scheduling decision. They took a player who has the passionate backing of 110 million people, who had already demonstrated she could draw massive crowds, and they scheduled her on an outer court that holds maybe a few hundred spectators at most. What exactly did they think was going to happen? That everyone would politely watch on their phones from home and not try to actually see their national hero play in person? The fact that this became such a massive, chaotic issue shows just how out of touch tournament organizers can be with the rapidly changing demographics of tennis fandom. They're still operating under outdated assumptions that the only players who draw massive crowds are the established Western stars like the Big Three, Serena Williams, players from traditional tennis powerhouses. But the sport is globalizing faster than the infrastructure and traditional thinking can keep up with, and Alex Eala is living proof of that transformation. Djokovic made this point exceptionally well when he talked about finding the delicate balance between managing enthusiastic crowds and maintaining a quality experience for fans and players. He witnessed what happened with Eala and clearly recognized it as a preview of what's coming in tennis's future. Fresh markets, absolutely ravenous fan bases from countries that have never had tennis stars before, and complete chaos when those passionate fan bases show up en masse to support their heroes. The old model of scheduling and court assignment simply doesn't account for the kind of cultural phenomenon that Eala represents. Tournament directors are still thinking in terms of rankings and seedings, not cultural impact and national representation. That needs to change quickly. What's genuinely wild and somewhat unprecedented is that Eala's rise to this level of fame and cultural significance happened almost instantly, like flipping a switch. Normally, tennis likes to slow cook its stars over many years. You grind on the tour for half a decade, slowly move up the rankings through consistent results, gradually build a following through compelling matches and memorable moments. It's a process, a journey that fans follow over time. But with Eala, the trajectory has been completely different and much more compressed. One moment she's a promising junior player that hardcore tennis fans know about. The next she's got an entire nation of over 100 million people tracking her every single move, analyzing every match, and showing up in massive numbers to watch her compete. That's not the normal path to tennis stardom, This creates a really interesting and challenging dynamic because the sport's infrastructure absolutely wasn't built for this kind of sudden global celebrity status. Court bookings, television time slots, media obligations and interview schedules, practice court access, all of that is still designed around the traditional gradual path to stardom, where players slowly earn bigger stages through ranking points and tournament victories. When someone essentially jumps the line because of enormous cultural and national significance, rather than ranking points or Grand Slam titles, it creates friction, confusion, and logistical nightmares. Tournament directors don't know how to handle it. Schedulers get caught off guard. Security isn't prepared for the crowds. That's why Djokovic's comments matter so tremendously and carry so much weight. He's been through exactly this himself. He knows intimately what it's like to carry the hopes and dreams of an entire country on your shoulders. Serbia isn't the Philippines in terms of total population, obviously, but the pressure and expectations are remarkably similar. When Djokovic talks about celebrity being a golden prison, about the burden of national expectation, he's speaking directly from personal experience. He understands that dynamic better than almost anyone. The same wave of adoration and national pride that lifts you up and provides incredible support can absolutely drown you if you're not mentally and emotionally prepared for the intensity. For someone as young as Eala, who's still learning how to compete consistently at the professional level against the best players in the world, that pressure is absolutely enormous and potentially overwhelming. She's not just trying to win matches and improve her ranking like other players her age. She's simultaneously managing the expectations of millions of people who see her success as their success, who take her losses personally, who view her as representing their entire nation. That's a completely different level of mental and emotional burden than what most young professional players deal with during their development. The mob scene at her Australian Open match wasn't just random casual fans being excited about good tennis. Those were true believers who had crossed oceans, spent significant money, and fought through massive crowds because they were absolutely desperate to see their icon compete in person. They weren't primarily there for the tennis itself necessarily. They were there for what Eala represents to them, for the pride and inspiration she provides. That transforms what would normally be a standard early round match into a genuine spectacle that outshines and draws more attention than whatever matches are happening on the main show courts. Djokovic recognized this dynamic immediately, and instead of criticizing the chaos or suggesting the fans were somehow out of line, he celebrated it as evidence of tennis's growth and expanding global reach. He essentially said these frenzies are inevitable and actually positive when the sport successfully outgrows its existing infrastructure and traditional assumptions. The first week of any Grand Slam tournament is always chaotic with incredibly tight schedules and dozens of compelling storylines competing for attention. But the rise of players like Eala from non-traditional tennis countries shows how genuinely complex the puzzle has become for tournament organizers. Fan engagement isn't just about rankings and trophy counts anymore. It's about cultural weight, national pride, representation, and emotional connection. Those factors can sometimes matter more than actual results, especially in the early stages of a player's career. When the greatest player in tennis history publicly backs and validates a young player like this, it accomplishes two critically important things. First, it legitimizes all the hype and attention surrounding her. People can try to dismiss fan excitement as irrational nationalism or whatever, as people getting ahead of themselves. But when Novak Djokovic, the man with 24 Grand Slam titles, calls you a superstar and discusses your cultural significance, that's validation from someone who knows exactly what it takes to operate at the absolute highest level of professional tennis. Second, it provides her with meaningful protection from some of the inevitable criticism and scrutiny that comes with this kind of sudden fame and attention. There are always going to be cynical people who say the attention is completely undeserved or premature, that she hasn't won enough titles or achieved enough results to justify the massive hype and coverage. But Djokovic's very public endorsement effectively shuts that criticism down. He's essentially telling the entire tennis world that the hype is real, that it's justified, and that everyone better adjust to this new reality because it's not going away. The comparison Djokovic drew between the modern Australian Open and what the tournament was like when he started competing there in the early 2000s, is actually pretty stunning when you think about it. He talked about using borrowed gyms from football clubs and sharing ice baths with Australian rules players. Now the tournament has absolutely state-of-the-art everything, facilities that rival any sporting event in the world. That remarkable transformation happened because tennis invested heavily in itself, expanded its global footprint, and successfully grew its commercial appeal. But with that growth and investment, inevitably comes new challenges, including how to properly handle situations where a player's cultural significance and ability to draw crowds outweighs their current seeding or ranking position. Djokovic's broader point about strongly preferring overcrowded stadiums to empty ones is something that tournament organizers genuinely need to internalize and remember. The absolute worst thing that can happen to any sport is widespread apathy. People simply not caring enough to show up or pay attention. If audiences don't care, if they're indifferent, you're completely dead in the water as a sport. The business model collapses. The fact that thousands of passionate people are literally fighting to get into a side court to watch a young player from the Philippines is exactly the kind of problem you desperately want to have. It means tennis is successfully breaking into enormous new markets and capturing the imagination of people who never previously cared about the sport at all. That's precisely how you build genuine, long-term growth and financial sustainability. Yes, it absolutely creates logistical headaches and operational challenges in the short term. Crowd control becomes difficult, scheduling gets complicated, security concerns arise, but those are genuinely good problems to solve because they stem from success and growing interest. You figure out solutions. You build bigger venues, improve crowd management systems, adjust scheduling protocols to account for cultural factors. What you fundamentally cannot fix or solve is lack of interest and apathy. You can't manufacture passion where none exists. The elephant in the room that nobody in tennis administration wants to directly address is whether the tennis establishment is actually prepared to handle this new era of global stars from non-traditional countries. The sport has been dominated by players from a relatively small group of traditional tennis nations for decades. Europe, North America, Australia. Now you've got rising stars from places like the Philippines who bring absolutely massive, passionate fan bases that don't fit the traditional model at all. Are tournaments going to genuinely adapt their thinking and operational approaches? Or are they going to stubbornly keep scheduling these players on inadequate outer courts and then act surprised when complete chaos ensues? Eala's situation is a legitimate test case for how tennis handles the next phase of globalization. If the sport can successfully integrate these new markets and passionate fan bases without alienating traditional audiences, that's an enormous win for everyone involved. But if the establishment treats these players as novelties or disruptions rather than embracing them as the future of tennis, that's a catastrophic missed opportunity that will absolutely come back to haunt the sport. Djokovic clearly sees Eala as a fundamental part of tennis's future, not some temporary flash in the pan who will fade once the initial excitement dies down. His comments weren't patronizing or dismissive in any way. He treated her like a legitimate peer who simply happens to be at an earlier stage of her career development. That's genuinely significant coming from someone who has won more Grand Slam titles than anyone else in history and has absolutely earned the right to gatekeep if he wanted to. The fact that he actively chose to elevate her instead shows he understands where the sport is headed and what tennis needs to remain relevant. Tennis cannot survive indefinitely on the same European and American stars forever. The sport desperately needs fresh faces from diverse backgrounds who can capture new audiences globally and keep tennis relevant across different cultures and markets. Eala fits that profile absolutely perfectly, which is why her success or failure matters beyond just her individual career trajectory. What happens with her will influence how tennis approaches the next generation of global stars. What happens next in Alex Eala's career is going to be absolutely fascinating to watch unfold. Can she handle the enormous pressure and develop into the elite player everyone hopes and expects she can become? Will major tournaments learn from the Australian Open chaos and fundamentally adjust how they schedule and promote players with massive cultural followings? Can the tennis establishment embrace this new era of global stars from unexpected places, or will they cling stubbornly to outdated models that no longer reflect the sport's rapidly changing demographics? Djokovic's public praise gives Eala credibility and meaningful protection as she navigates all of these challenges. When criticism inevitably comes, and it absolutely will come because it always does with young, hyped players, she can point to the fact that Novak Djokovic called her a superstar and recognized what she represents. That's powerful armor against the doubters and cynics who want to tear down anyone receiving attention they think is undiscerned. The broader conversation about the Australian Open becoming too commercial and corporate is interesting from a philosophical standpoint, but kind of beside the point practically. Every single major sporting event has gone through this exact evolution. Money and corporate sponsorships fund the enormous prize pools and world-class facilities that make the sport attractive to top players. You simply cannot have world-class professional tennis without massive investment. And that investment inevitably comes with strings attached. What matters far more than commercial concerns is whether the sport maintains its competitive soul and integrity while aggressively chasing growth and revenue. So far, tennis has done a genuinely decent job of that compared to many other professional sports. The on-court product remains compelling and authentic. The rivalries feel real rather than manufactured. The best players generally win regardless of their marketing value or commercial appeal. As long as that fundamental integrity continues, the commercial stuff is really just background noise. So there you have it. Novak Djokovic didn't just casually compliment Eala in passing. He basically anointed her as representing the future of tennis and publicly called out the establishment for not being adequately prepared for what she represents. The chaos at her Australian Open match wasn't a bug in the system that needs to be fixed. It was a feature demonstrating that the sport is growing in ways nobody anticipated or prepared for. Eala has received the ultimate stamp of approval from the greatest player who has ever lived. Now the real question is whether she can handle the pressure, continue developing her game, and ultimately deliver on the enormous promise that has 110 million people believing she can become something truly special. The tennis world is watching, and thanks to Djokovic's words, everyone is paying attention. If you think Eala represents something exciting for tennis's future, make sure you're following this story closely. Drop your thoughts in the comments about whether she can live up to the absolutely enormous hype and expectations. Can she become the superstar that Djokovic says she already is? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain. The journey is going to be absolutely fascinating to watch.